Today we have Rob Ferguson, who is an author and activist in East London, a member of the Socialist Worker Party. He went to Russia during the 1996 Chechen War and was in the Western mining region. He's also written this new pamphlet, which is Ukraine, No to War, No to Russian Invasion, No to NATO Escalation. Just a bit of a reminder of how our meetings work. Rob is going to speak for 30 minutes and then we will have a discussion from the floor and then Rob will come back to sum up. So I think I'm just going to kick off and get it started. Thank you, everyone.
On the 10th of July 1989, the night shift at the Shevyakov mine in Mezhdoreshensk, a gold city in the western Siberian region of the Kuzbas, Russia's biggest coal basin, struck. The following morning they were joined by the day shift. The strike spread across the city's mines, 12,000 miners marching in work clothes, black with coal dust, onto the central square, banging their helmets on the asphalt. The strike spread across the Kuzbas to Karaganda in Kazakhstan, to Vorkuta in the Arctic, to the Donbass in the east of Ukraine and to the coal basins in Ukraine's west. Across the Soviet Union, miners elected strike committees, permanent meetings held in the squares. Demands began with soap, food supplies, then housing, safer working conditions, escalating to calls for control over production, measures against environmental pollution. In Kazakhstan, miners demanded an end to nuclear testing. In Vorkuta, strikers demanded an end to the leading role of the Communist Party and free elections. We don't need just sausage and soap, went a slogan, we need freedom. Why start this meeting in 1989, a decade before Putin's rise to power? It's important because the Russian working class hardly appears in Western narratives. One common argument is that workers accept rigged, uncontested elections, corruption, and so on, while the regime provides rising living standards and stability. Another that Russians are simply apolitical and submissive, or that Putin's popularity flows from Russian culture, the desire for a strong leader and authoritarian rule. We need to reject all this. It is a working class with the potential power like any other. It is educated and skilled. Manufacturing, metallurgy, construction, transport, logistics account for 30% of the working class. Healthcare and education, another 13%. Workers in the energy industry clearly have enormous potential power. It's true that the mining workforce has shrunk to a fraction of its previous numbers, yet Kuzbas produces more coal today than in 1991. The working class in Russia is part of the world working class and holds the same power to challenge its rulers as any other. And we need to insist on its agency and its potential to act as the subject, not just the object of history. The 1989 strikes shook the Soviet state and were an instrumental factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union, from which ruins Putin's Russia emerged. Okay. In October 1991, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin addressed Russia's Congress of People's Deputies, announcing a one-time changeover to market prices. He assured Russians that after a 6-month period of economic pain, prices would fall, the market would revive, shelves would fill with goods, the economy stabilise, and living standards rise. Yeltsin's speech heralded the era of shock therapy, consisting of 3 elements: price liberalisation, slashing social provision, and privatisation. The Russian economy suffered an unprecedented collapse. Workers went unpaid for months, life savings and pensions evaporated. In 1992, inflation soared to 1,354%. Real incomes fell by 46%. 32% of children were classified as hungry. Male life expectancy fell from 64 to 57 in the space of just 3 years, and Russian suicide rates rose to the highest in the world. Destruction of Russian industry exceeded that of the Great Depression. Loss of industrial capacity was greater than that in the Second World War. GDP declined by 43%, industrial production by 56%, capital investment by 78%. Some 60% of intercompany exchange was by barter. So why shock therapy? Anatole Lieven called it poltergeist economics. It's a good description, but we need to explain a bit further. In the era of multinational capitalism, the state capitalist closed command economy of the Soviet Union had become a barrier. Russia couldn't match the productivity derived from globalized production and an international division of labor. Shock therapy was conceived as enabling a leap into the world market and globalized production. In reality, it exposed the barriers to Russian capital's ability to reconstitute itself on a par with the world's most developed economies. Putin was appointed Prime Minister by Yeltsin in August 1999 and elected president the following March. He rose to power at a watershed moment for the Russian state. In 1998, economic crisis swept in from Asia, bringing renewed collapse. The 1990s crisis was also a crisis of state authority. Regional and industrial bosses and Russia's oligarchs established their independent bases of power, taking control over resources and industries to raise revenues and profits for themselves, regardless of the effect on the economy as a whole. The crisis had a devastating impact on Russia's ability to project state power. Between 1989 and 1999, Russia's defense budget decreased by a factor of 7. Funding for military plant and equipment cut by more than 75%. However, while Russia emerged from the Soviet collapse a weakened power, it was not powerless. Russia commanded the world's second largest nuclear arsenal and the largest conventional force in the region. Most of the 14 former Soviet republics, the new independent states, were heavily dependent on Russian energy and a shared industrial and economic infrastructure. So Russia faced severe limits on its power, but that made those limits all the more important to defend. This is what is called Russia's near abroad, where Russia sought to assert dominance over its Eurasian borderlands. Here we have the Eurasian fault line, stretching from the Balkans through Belarus, Ukraine, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Caspian to Central Asia, China, and the Pacific. Between 1991 and 96, Russia played a brutal role in a series of invasions, civil wars, and secessionist conflicts. Russia and Ukraine hovered on the verge of open confrontation. Ukraine at this point was the world's third nuclear power, all over the naval base of Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet in particular. And dependency on raw material extraction, export and the transit routes for oil and gas across the near abroad were a key driver. By 2021, Russia was the world's largest exporter of natural gas, the second largest exporter of crude oil, and the third largest exporter of coal. Half of Russia's federal budget comes from oil and gas revenues. Putin rose on the backs of the reformers of the Yeltsin era. He was appointed director of the Federal Security Service, the old KGB, and head of the Security Council during the Kosovan War. He was appointed Prime Minister 2 days after the Chechen incursion into Dagestan in August 1999, replacing a predecessor who had been reluctant to embark on a second Chechen war. 2 weeks later, Putin orders an aerial bombardment of Chechnya, followed by invasion. Putin also begins to reassert state authority within Russia, what he termed the vertical of power. Direct elections of regional governors were scrapped, and Putin asserts state direction over the energy industry with state majority shareholdings. He disciplines the oligarchs, seizing the holdings of those who promote Western interests over those of the Russian state, and even jailing the biggest, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, 10 years for tax fraud. Putin's assertion of state authority is often seen as simply undermining the power of the oligarchs. But this really is mistaken. The majority of the oligarchs supported Putin. In fact, he was shifting power and influence away from finance and the media moguls to Russia's energy, mineral and metallurgical industrial base. In reality, Putin's rise and consolidation in power reflected the interests of Russia's whole ruling class in strengthening the state and its ability to project power. And we have to understand the dynamic of external pressures on the Russian state. I won't say much about NATO, not because it's not important, but it has been the subject of other meetings and recent articles in international socialism and so on. But what is crucial to understand is first the assertion of US global hegemony in the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq and the Middle East was accompanied in Europe by the expansion of NATO and the EU as Russia attempted to assert its own dominance over its near abroad. This rivalry led to war in Georgia in 2008, Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014, and the annexation of Crimea, and now, of course, the current war. And secondly, the Atlantic Alliance strategy of containment of Russia through enlargement had an economic dimension. Both the EU and Russia attempting to form competing economic blocs. Now, Russia was now firmly integrated into the world market, but its position was overdetermined by its role as an energy supplier. This is a powerful role, but one that imposes limits on Russian development. Russian industry has not been able to compete in terms of productivity and what's called added value with the US, the EU, China, and so on. It suffers a huge deficit of advanced technology and low foreign direct investment. This is GDP in current US dollars. Compare the size of Russia's economy. This shows gross domestic product for the US, China, and Russia. The US economy over 10 times Russia's size. China and the EU each over 7 times. This also has implications for Russia's ability to project power and its military capacity. It's not negligible, but as we're seeing in Ukraine, it's not without its limits either. There is a huge disparity in conventional military power between Russia and its rivals. NATO's precision-guided weapons, penetrating munitions, long-range cruise missiles, drones, stealth bombers, communications, space reconnaissance, etc., far exceed anything the Russian military can match. This next graph shows military expenditure as a percentage of the economy, if you like, of GDP. So Russia's military expenditure as a percentage of GDP actually tracks, even exceeds, that of the US. You can think of this, if you like, as the drain on the economy, the pressure to compete militarily. But look at how this then translates into absolute military expenditure. Russia at around now $60 billion. The US over 10 times as high, 800 billion. China, over 200 billion, and the European Union, each over 200 billion. One terrifying rider. Russia is the world's second nuclear power and has more tactical nuclear warheads than all its rivals put together. And Russia's military doctrine explicitly centres reliance on its nuclear capability. Putin's strategic aim after 2000 was to cement former Soviet states as far as possible into an economic bloc, to create a wider Eurasian economic area of development, diversify and develop its own economy while securing its vital base in gas, oil and mineral extraction, and not least stave off revolt or challenge to the regime. So let's turn to the Putin regime. First of all, the economy. From the early 2000s, the regime was the beneficiary of the worldwide boom in oil prices. In 1998, Urals crude fetched $9 a barrel. By 2002, it doubled. By 2008, $138 a barrel. GDP increased by an average of 7% a year, and tax revenues filled state coffers. Real incomes rose by 10% a year, and poverty levels dropped from 30% to under 18%. Nonetheless, Russian industry remained unable to match the productivity and value added of the advanced sectors of the global economy. It remained dependent on imports of advanced technology, electronics, microchip technology and so on, including for its military. So Russia's GDP grew from $210 billion in 1999 to around 1.2 trillion in 2020. But as a share of global GDP, it is back to where Putin started in 1998. Russia's share of the world economy in 2020 stood at 3% compared to the combined share of the US and the EU of 43%. So Russia is falling behind the rate of growth of rival powers. In order to overcome its containment, the Putin regime attempted, through the 2000s, to forge a European, Eurasian economic space, trying to exploit tensions between US interests and those particularly of Germany and France, while forging links with China and Asia. All this, however, fell short, particularly in the face of EU and NATO expansion. In 1994, Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor, key figure of US imperialism, declared partnership with Russia impossible. Russia is too large, currently too backward, and potentially too powerful, he declared. Russia would dilute the Western character of the EU, he argued, and drive a wedge in the Atlantic Alliance. And Brzezinski's dictum has essentially been held by the Atlantic Alliance ever since. After the financial crisis of 2008, growth rates and foreign investment fall, accelerated in 2014 by sanctions. In 2018, Putin attempts to marshal state investment to spark growth at the expense of the Russian working class. The regime hikes the retirement age for men from 60 to 65 and for women from 55 to 63. This is when male life expectancy in Russia is 66. Putin's popularity slumps to 49%. Mass protests erupt across Russia. And these protests are important because they point to the potential vulnerability of the regime. They came on the back of the longest sustained 4-year high in Putin's popularity above 80%, following the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And the polls only recovered this year after the February invasion. The first major protests against Putin came in 2004-05, against a direct attack again on the working class as the regime attempted to replace benefits free transport, medicine, subsidised housing and energy with small cash payments. This saw a 20-point plunge in Putin's popularity. 100,000 took to the streets across Russia. Protests took place across 360 towns, forcing the regime to retreat. 2012 saw the mass so-called Bolotnaya protest against electoral fraud in the parliamentary elections and Putin's fixed reinstallation as president for a third term, heavily repressed with mass arrests and political trials. It was these protests that launched the anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny, now poisoned and jailed. Navalny is a determined figure, but politically opportunist, with past associations with the extreme right. He's equated Muslims to cockroaches, advocated deportation of migrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus, and so on. His protests are organised very much as calls from the top and have a stage character. However, they do attract an important layer of support, particularly from youth, who can't just be identified with Navalny's politics. And we, of course, saw the fantastically courageous protests at the beginning of the war, again met with mass arrests, threat of 15-year prison terms, loss of jobs, and so on. The shock therapy of the 1990s had a devastating impact on Russian workers. There was widespread resistance and strikes, particularly in the mid-1990s, but they tended to be enterprise-based and didn't generalise. Privatisation served to divide workers between more profitable enterprises as others went to the war. The old official trade unions sided with enterprise bosses in attempts to extract subsidies and funds from Moscow, while the new independent unions that arose during the miners' strikes were fatally compromised by support for economic reforms. However, we do need to remember that the Russian working class is hardly alone in confronting periods of defeat and low levels of struggle. There was also a link between revolts in the former Soviet states and Russia. The ruling classes of the new independent states faced similar crises and threats to their regimes. They responded by fomenting national and ethnic divisions to try and cement their rule. The revolts were often triggered by election fraud. The Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, so on, Belarus, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and of course the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. As well as revolt from below, with different degrees of success, factions of the ruling class attempted to divert these revolts under their own banner, and crucially over the question of orientation to Russia on the one hand or towards the EU and NATO on the other. So most recently, in Belarus and Kazakhstan, Russian intervention played a critical role, both in aiding the regimes to crush the revolts and to shield the rulers from challenge by Western leaning factions within the ruling class. So for the Putin regime, revolt in Russia's near abroad that threatens to trigger revolt in Russia at the same time as threatening to strengthen their Western rivals. Today, the ugly face of the regime is in full flow. Anti-war activists have been driven from the public space by repression and a vicious climate of vilification. In March, Putin said the West was betting on a fifth column, calling opponents of war scum and traitors to be spat out like flies. Even before the war, protests faced bans, fines, and arrests. There's no doubt that majority opinion in Russia supports the war. Nonetheless, polls show somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 opposing it, higher amongst the young. Now that's not nothing. Second, support for the war is driven overwhelmingly by attitudes to NATO. Almost 60% of Russians believe NATO and the US bear responsibility for the war, compared to 17% who blame Kiev and 7% who blame Russia. 60% of Russians aged 18 to 24 believe the war could grow into armed conflict with NATO. 50% are afraid Russia may use nuclear weapons. So building an anti-war movement in the West that opposes both the Russian invasion and NATO is, in my view, indispensable. Any hope of building a mass anti-war movement in Russia depends on anti-war activists being able to break the notion that opposition to Russia's war implies support for Western imperialism. Russia's war is increasingly cast simply as driven by the chauvinist fantasies of Putin and his autocratic rule. Putin is certainly a foul Russian chauvinist with fantasies of empire. But this doesn't explain the drive to inter-imperialist war on the European landmass, any more than the militarism of the Kaiser in 1914 explained the First World War. And the US, and I remember the US neocons' Project for a New American Century, which may have provided an ideological driver for US global hegemony, but hardly serves as an explanation of US imperialism. The Putin regime is also often described as kleptocratic, as if motivated solely by personal profit and thievery. Now, there is that, but again, it does not help us understand Russia as a capitalist imperialist power. A more sophisticated version, held by some on the Russian left, is of a regime that defends capitalist interests but deprives capitalists themselves of political power. The Russian Marxist political scientist Ilya Matveyev has argued this position. This too is mistaken and feeds into a dangerous conclusion that somehow the war will drive a rupture between the Putin regime and the capitalists who depend on profit. In an article just after the invasion, Matveyev and another Marxist academic and activist, Ilya Varoufakis, wrote, "Russia is the only country in the world that speaks like an imperialist power from the early 20th century. The Kremlin's actions are beyond rationally understood interests and lie somewhere in the realm of a historical mission, as Putin understands it." I'm sorry, but this is wrong, from beginning to end. And it serves to justify a logic of support for NATO weapons in order to hasten the day of Putin's isolation and demise. The problem is this: there's no auto-destruct button. Lenin and the Bolsheviks didn't argue the First World War would do the job of bringing down Tsarism for them. Their slogan was turn the imperialist war between nations into a war between classes, not only in Russia, but in every imperialist camp. There's much at stake. We have to understand Russia as part of a competing system of capitalist states, compelled to ruthlessly project its power over other states and against its own working class. War drives fault lines and conflicts through society between our class and theirs. The job of the left and anti-war movement is to do everything possible to shape the outcome. Russia's history is a lesson for the international left of the price of defeat, but also the promise of victory and revolution for Russia's working class and for workers of every nation against imperialist war and the system that breeds it.
Thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was very informative about all of the geopolitics that are going on in the Russian near abroad, and it's a very topical discussion. And I think what's kind of missing from this is what is the source of how Russia devolved into this gross imperialist state. And I think what we can do is we can compare China, right? We can compare China and Russia and their experiences in the transition from communism to capitalism. China embarked on this journey of privatization that was coupled with allowing state-owned enterprises to fail in their own right. And the process was gradual. After 1978, you had the reform and opening up period, and cycles of liberalization and retrenchment. So not shock therapy, as you describe it, which is what happened in Russia, but more gradual. And pricing for agricultural products. There was a dual-track pricing system where farmers would sell at procurement prices to the state, and then everything above that was sold for profit at market prices. The result of this was still, this transition to capitalism was still rapid inflation. Inflation, which led to the Tiananmen Square revolt and the brutal quelling of the revolt. To wrap up, I'll just say that China has tried to learn from Russia's mistakes, and Russia has barely developed in many sectors. So its short-term imperialist gains and nostalgia are the best that they can hope for, and this is annoying even to China.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the red t-shirt in about the 5th row.
Hans Peter from the Bolshevik Tendency. I think the presentation of the economic development of Russia after the capitalist counter-revolution in 1991 is quite indicative of where Russia stands in the world order today. The military is, in a way, in an unusual size back from the Soviet days because the capitalist rulers of Russia haven't been able to demobilize it in fear of social revolt. But the economy was opened up by Yeltsin in a shock therapy. The West loved this. They came in with their big corporations. And as has been said, Brzezinski and other US planners, like US Vice President Dick Cheney, former Vice President, have actually suggested to balkanize Russia into multiple smaller states. The Orange revolutions, of course, were partly driven by rightful dissent with the Bonapartist rulers of these countries, but they have been funded fundamentally by NATO. And so what Russia has been trying to do is to avoid NATO encirclement, because bringing nuclear weapons into the direct border states poses a direct threat, and that's why Putin is relatively popular still amongst the populations of Russia, because they understand now that Putin came in response to Yeltsin and shored up some of the industries. That doesn't mean that revolutionary Marxists don't want to overthrow him by workers' revolution, but it shows that he has been trying to stabilize the Bonapartist semi-colonial regime against imperialist exploitation. And the war in Ukraine is part of that, because the Ukrainian regime has been massively funded by NATO. They wouldn't be able to...
Can I ask you to sum up now, please?
Okay, sure. They wouldn't be able to even lead this war at this minute if it hadn't been for NATO. And the national question in the East, where the Russian speakers have been suppressed by the regime, has triggered this, plus NATO expansion. So I think
Can
the
you
left...
stop talking now, Comrade?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm going to go to the black t-shirt in the front, and then right at the top to the white t-shirt after that.
Hi, I've been doing quite a bit of work recently with Russian socialists in Berlin, and it's to generalise from a few people, there's some interesting things happening. First, they are young, majority female, very brave people. A lot of the initial actions that happened in Russia, the support was happening from outside Russia, the online work and things like that, because people in Russia are in danger of being jailed. And the people who've got skin in the game, who have been very much involved in supporting the protests, as a result of which there is now a huge wave of demoralisation, because there's a feeling, okay, we tried bringing people on the streets, it worked temporarily, now we've been crushed. This is done with, let's say, an ambiguous relationship to NATO. One of them said to me, it took leaving Russia to go to Germany to realise that NATO might be the bad guys, because constantly the state media, the Putin speeches, that it's about how horrible NATO is. And the idea was, well, if Putin doesn't like them, there must be something about them. And so there is a feeling, at least an openness to NATO maybe part of the solution, which has come to, again, an ambiguous call for sending weapons. Although ultimately, I think they don't trust NATO either. I think these are people with whom you've got to engage with them where they are. If we say that the solution to the problem is by revolt in Russia, revolt in the UK, you need to engage with the Russian socialists where they are. They are very open for discussion. So I mean, I think there's two mistakes you can make. There's one is made by a degree of the left, which is saying, hey, the war is all NATO's fault, and that relieves Putin of any responsibility of what's happening, relieves him of any agency. That really doesn't appeal to the people of the socialists in Russia at all. They know what Putin is and who he is. But the others refuse to actually have hard arguments with them and say, yeah, we know we're all for getting rid of it. We do want the Ukrainian resistance from, but we're not the people with weapons. It's NATO the people with weapons, and bringing NATO only makes it harder. I think that you get a degree with that. There's a question of, Rob, how do we go further with the Russian socialists who don't have a mass movement to relate to, and how do we go forward together to strengthen them and to make sure that we do get something which is capable of getting rid of Putin from within Russia?
Thank you. I just ask people to keep for 3 minutes. We have a lot of people who want to speak, so so go to the white T-shirt at the top, and then there is a comrade in the cheetah print fleece at the top of the room.
Thanks, Tom Ash, the online editor of Socialist Work. I want to make 2 points. The first is about Putin, because the dominant narrative is that you saw the collapse of communism. Then along came Boris Yeltsin, who pursued a short period of democracy and free market reforms, and then along came Putin, the revanchist KGB man who brought back state control and crushed democracy. And this is false. The Soviet Union, despite the communist rhetoric, was a state capitalist country. The state bureaucracy within that country accumulated capital on the backs of ordinary working class people, locked into competition with the West. But by the 1980s, significant sections of that bureaucracy could see that they needed to reform, they needed to open up more to the market, and Putin was part of those sections of the bureaucracy. You know, he might have been a KGB man in the 80s, but by 1990, 1991, he was working in the new mayor in St. Petersburg, pushing through free market reforms. He supported the reforms that were being pushed through by Yeltsin. And Yeltsin, by the way, built a lot of the authoritarian structures of the state within Russia, the Sobchak constitution in '96 and so on. And therefore, there isn't this sense of break between Yeltsin and Putin. It actually is a sense of building on that. I think that's important. The second thing is about the weaknesses of the Russian state and why it's actually intervened. And I think often, when an imperialist power like Russia is faced with relative economic weakness, it can seek to use military force in order to try and overcome this. And the reason I think that Putin went for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine isn't some sort of defensive measure. There's no such thing as a defensive imperialist power. It's because Russia was losing the tug of war with the West over Ukraine since 2014. Simply intervening in the Donbass wasn't enough to stop Ukraine pivoting towards the West, and therefore a full-scale invasion was a rational move, not just by Putin, but by the Russian state and Russian capital to try and assert its interests.
Now, please, comrade. Thank you. So the teacher please, and I'm going to go to the grey shirt right at the top of the stairs.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really good that Rob started actually with, the resistance from below, the mass resistance from below that actually brought the fall of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. And, people wouldn't have, gone on strike and gone out and protested in their masses if it hadn't been that they were, fighting back against, a highly bureaucratic and authoritarian regime. But, also what we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union was that the bureaucrats became the bosses and the politicians and the CEOs. And now we've seen, as Rob has described, the process of Russia increasingly competing on a global stage. And one of the things I found quite interesting is that, while they might have quite a low GDP, actually it seems as though Russia's focused quite a lot of their attention on nuclear weapons, which actually means that while they might not be the wealthiest country, that doesn't mean they're not extremely dangerous. Now, however, ruling classes do not, exist on their own. And, the US and NATO have a role to play in this as well. Lenin called them a band of warring brothers. So they're brothers, but they are at war with each other. And I think that's where it becomes really important that we start to talk about how, the drive to war is increasing attacks on working class people, both here, across the world, but in Russia too. And that it's being used to justify the cost of living crisis. Why are prices going up? Because of war. Why is fuel prices going up? Because of the war. And I think, that's why we do have to come back to this argument of, the main enemy is at home. And actually, in order to, fight in solidarity with people around the world against war, whether it's in Russia, Ukraine, is actually by fighting our own government. Yes, around the cost of living crisis. However, we can't say that just the cost of living crisis alone, fighting on it, means that we'll fight against war. So we have to, as socialists, we have to inject the movement against war into that movement. I think that's why we need revolutionaries as part of both the working class struggle, but also in the anti-war movement.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to the comrade in the grey shirt, and then after them, I'm going to go to the comrade in the blue top, right at the back of the room. Great shirt. Sorry, I'll take you after the comrade after.
First of all, thank you very much.
Yes.
Hold it right, kind of right into
Is that right? Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Rob, for that very detailed account of Russian development over the last 30 so years. I think it's very important, your starting point in terms of understanding Russia under Stalin as a state capitalist regime. Important because that explains the post-war imperialism of the Russian state, its way in which it pushed westwards in order to create depth which tried to compensate for its relative weakness economically vis-à-vis the West. And that's important because we can then explain why the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a shift from non-capitalism to capitalism, it was a shift sideways from state capitalism to market capitalism. And we can argue about the specifics of the difference between Russia and China, but that doesn't alter that basic fact about the nature of the world in which we live. I think this is important for one very important reason to do with the war that we now confront. If you see Russia as in some sense exceptional, somehow fundamentally different, then actually you can reach two conclusions. One is it is simply a victim of the West, in which case why not side with it? Or it is the West which is okay because Russia is a peculiar, barbaric, exceptional state. It's important that we don't fall into either of those traps for the reasons I think we want to concentrate on, the nature of the working class. He started with the working class revolt. It's important we understand that as the bedrock of our politics, and therefore rooting the anti-war movement in that understanding becomes vital. It's not only no to Russian invasion and no to NATO, it's an understanding of how we build a movement that's capable of confronting that East and West. And that is based on the working class, looking to the working class, not expecting, as Gilbert Achcar seems to think, that somehow NATO can suddenly be a good guy as opposed to being a bad guy. It's important to understand that. It may be very difficult, but that's the only way forward. I think the confidence that we have in terms of what we see at the moment in terms of resistance, say, in Britain around economic issues, that can transfer into a political task, which becomes very, very important. The last speaker mentioned the question of relating the two. I think we have to understand that's the importance of the state capitalist analysis in terms of Russia that I think enables Rob to make such a brilliant analysis of the regime today.
Thank you. Yes. Comrade in the pattern shirt in the back row, and then after that it will be the comrade behind the comrade who just spoke. So yeah, I've got you, I promise.
I was just going to say it's really positive what you said about, that especially among the young people in Russia, like there's 1 in 4, against the war, and that, obviously the only way, as you said, that we can help and support that anti-war movement in Russia is to build the anti-war movement here. But I think the difficulty is that, well, I feel anyway, that the anti-war movement here in the UK hasn't really taken off as it did kind of previously. And I know, like what the comrade said over there, obviously we have to keep having those arguments, but I know there's been a lot of difficulties sometimes in the trade unions when motions have been raised, you know, about supporting NATO, not supporting NATO. So is it that we just keep on having those arguments? Because I think, you know, it's all that propaganda is just never ending, you know, every day, you know, Russia bad, Ukraine good, you know, everywhere you see flags, you know, kids, I mean, a colleague here was saying, you know, at school, kids are having to fill in, you know, like colouring flags for Ukraine, you know, it's like never ending. And I know we have to kind of stand up against that. But is that what we just keep on doing, just arguing? And obviously it's great, like, you know, the RNT strikes, and, you know, I understand all that can kind of feed into that political kind of anti-war movement. And I know that's the only way to do it, because those people in Russia are just so incredibly brave. But I do feel it's kind of difficult still.
There is a horrible racist argument that the Ukraine war is a war for Western values. I think that's despicable. It goes back to what we faced in the Iraq War. In that context, I think it's very useful to see the similarities between what is happening in Russia and what we experienced under Thatcher and afterwards. Tony Wood's book, Russia Without Putin, was very helpful. He shows three aspects of the privatisation. Selling shares in companies. Well, Margaret Thatcher's Tell Sid. Directors of Russian state-owned companies simply owning the company. The mingling between industrial magnates then merging and becoming part of the state and going back and forward. We see that all the time. The education secretary in this country who resigned and then went on to get a £50,000 a year contract for doing that, not very much at all. The creation of companies that act as intermediaries with state companies. That was another facet of the privatisation. Well, we're familiar with that, aren't we, with Serco and everything they did during the pandemic and everything. It is right to see the similarities between the two, and if you see the similarities between the two, you can see that both sets of capitalists are exactly that, capitals reforming themselves, changing themselves, but both equally enemies.
Thank you. After the person in the blue purple shirt in the fourth row, I will go to the person with the striped orange shirt in the middle.
Okay, Ian, just three questions, I guess, Rob. Could you give a description or a characterization of Putin's political party? Is it United Russia or whatever they call it? How would you categorize it? And what were the elections that they've won over the years fair? And also, as I understand it, the Communist Party of Russia, do they form the biggest opposition bloc in the parliament? And what if you know what they are saying about the current war and invasion in Iraq, in the Ukraine? Thanks very much.
Thank you. So yeah, the striped shirt all the way over the other way. Sorry about that. After that, I'm going to go to the white shirt, just kind of two down from the last speaker. Yeah, it's just the striped shirt, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the question of the difficulty of building the movement against the war, because I think we have found that in this country, but it's been, it's not unique to the UK. And I mean, I think what Rob was arguing was a reason in terms of the Russian working class and their struggle about how important it is that we do that. But we can also see in terms of the struggles in our own country, in terms of the UK, if we don't do it, what Boris Johnson gets away with. And I think that the difficulty is for two reasons. One is the propaganda from the ruling class, but the other is the confusion on the left. And I do think that it has become easier than since the invasion started. I mean, I think it is an easy argument that Boris Johnson only went to Kyiv to look after his own interests and not in the interests of Ukraine. I think that's much clearer to people. But I also think that the confusion on the left, which is very largely in this country fueled by the collapse of the Labour left under the attack from Keir Starmer. I mean, when you think that the Labour left could speak out against the war being prosecuted by Blair, and they were allowed to do that, but under a war now in opposition, the Labour left shut up when they're told to by Keir Starmer. So I think we have to find ways of building a different kind of alliance, because it can't just be done from the top down. And in Dorset, we had some successful, modestly successful meetings and protests, I think, by involving people around issues of climate and refugees, the things that make the broadest opposition to war, but at the same time as keeping crystal clear the opposition to the expansion of NATO. And so I think it isn't just plodding along. I think we have to find the tactical ways to reach out and find the new audiences, like the Quakers have got involved. And so I think it does mean us getting our thinking caps on to how we can involve other people.
Thank you. Just before we go to the person in the white shirt, we have a Zoom question. I would also like to say, for people on Zoom, you can't make, I'm really sorry you can't make contributions. I know that someone on the Zoom wanted to. So I'm just going to read this out. It's from Roger Green. He says, an understanding of state capitalism is absolutely crucial. It analyses what is happening and the solution to war in general. So that was from Zoom. So I'm just going to go to the person in the white shirt, and then I'm going to go to the person in the grey jumper at the front.
Yeah, thank you. Stan Keeble from Labour Party Marxists. And I just want to clarify that. I doesn't mean to say, like, you might think that I think the Labour Party is the answer. We're in the Labour Party to change it, and it does need that. I'm just sorry that the SWP didn't take part in the Corbyn movement that campaigned for unions to disaffiliate from Labour instead of coming in. You people should have been inside. And I'm afraid the left is down outside the Labour Party, and the left is down inside the Labour Party too. But it's still there, and the Labour Party is still a bourgeois workers' party, and that fight will come back to us, and we'll have to do it again. And that's really the same thing as tackling the trade union bureaucracy, isn't it? Where we need to have the anti-war movement taken in there. The last speaker was talking about the problem. The difference between now and the big demonstration in 2003 is that war was very unpopular, and this one is very popular. Unfortunately, we're building a mass movement on that. It's difficult. We've got to link it to capitalism. So I mean, I'm glad about that. That you're talking about capitalism is the cause, and we have to say that. And in Stop the War Coalition, that was never said. Your speakers got up and didn't say this is about capitalism causing war. They'd say it because that would be divisive, wouldn't it? And because the anti-war movement is broad. Bugger the word broad, right? We need a Marxist movement. And I'd just like to say, yeah, state capitalism, it wasn't state capitalism in the Soviet Union. The problem in the Soviet Union was the bureaucrats wanted to become capitalists.
Can you sum up now, please?
I will sum up. They couldn't accumulate. That's why things changed in 1991. They succeeded in going over to what I would call gangster capitalism. And what's being exported, talking about imperialism, what's being exported is not capital, but wealth, stolen wealth. That's what they're exporting. This is not imperialism. This is semi-colonialism.
Thank you, comrades. So I'm just going to, the last contribution, I'm going to go to the person in the kind of khaki jacket at the top of the room. Sorry to everyone who didn't make a contribution. I saw your hands. We've got a lot of people wanting to make contributions in this session, so I'm sorry about that.
So I think that we can draw a parallel between the resistance to the war in Ukraine now and the resistance to the First World War or the resistance to the Iraq War. So in the anti-war movement against the Iraq War, millions of people marched, but the war still went ahead. Yeah, in the First World War, the Second International with Karl Kautsky, it was perhaps the biggest international working class organisation that we've ever seen, but still, I believe what Lenin called it was it folded into miserable bankruptcy, and the war still went ahead for 8 bloody years. So what does working class organisation going to have to look like? How large is that organisation going to have to be in order to oppose a war? Because ultimately, I don't think so far that we've seen an effective working class resistance to war.
It's a good question. Thank you. I've only got a minute left, so I'm going to go back to Rob now.
Actually, I want to say, I'll start with the interesting question of China, because I think it does help reveal something about the dilemma, the cleft stick that the Russian ruling class faced. Because it is true that, in a sense, they followed different economic strategies when it came to shock therapy. But I don't really think this is the explanation, because you then have to go deeper and say, well, why shock therapy in one state capitalist place, state capital, and not the other? And here I think you have to go to the material basis. You see, China started opening up its economy from quite a low, relatively low industrial base. This meant it wasn't weighed down by the decades of old industrial infrastructure that state capitalism had developed since the 1930s. To make a graphic example, in 1978, the rural population of China was 82%. In Russia, 31%. By 2020, China had mobilized the rural population into the industries, the population falling from that 82% to around 39%. So it had huge resources of rural labour that it poured into industry at the same time that it was able to open up its seaboard for capital accumulation that was directly linked into the global market, global trade routes and so on, and was able to establish centres of capital accumulation in a way that the Russian ruling class had not been able to do. Look, I'm sorry, comrade, you got the date of the counter-revolution wrong. Maybe that was just a mistake on your part. The counter-revolution in Russia was in 1937, not in 1991, when the revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks were slaughtered by Stalin and the Russian working class subjected to the exploitation dictated by the competition on between world capitalist states. Look, and although the West did seek to profit in Russian markets, actually, as I pointed out, actually Western foreign direct investment in Russia is actually relatively incredibly low. And one last thing about Ukraine. One thing this war has exposed is the utter nonsense of Putin's claim to be defending ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. The prime victims of Russian slaughter in Ukraine have been ethnic Russians and Russian speakers across the east and south of Ukraine, which partly explains the huge shift from non-support for either NATO or Russia to support for NATO. Phil asked about what do we say to Russian left activists who oppose the war who are here, and I think Candy's approach partly addresses this. Look, the first thing I would say is patience. That's the first thing. Secondly, patient argument and discussion that focuses crucially on this question of the relationship between war and class. Because if there's one problem, I think, in sections of the Russian anti-war movement, it's a detachment from the question of Russia's working class, sometimes quite derogatory attitudes towards Russia's working class, and that raises too the question of internationalism and opposing imperialism. And I think we have to build a political current, whether it's in Russia, whether it's here in Britain, whether it's in Germany, and obviously there's differences between how effective we can be and how hostile the circumstances are, but the principle is the same. And after all, the hostile circumstances that are faced in Russia today are not so dissimilar in scale to the hostile circumstances faced by revolutionaries at the beginning of the First World War in 1914. Comrade raised at the back the question of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. In the West, and at the time in 1991, the Cold War was presented largely as an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. And therefore, once that ideological battle was apparently resolved, new opportunities would open up for a peaceful Europe of collaboration and so forth. The problem was the Cold War was not about an ideological battle. It was a battle between imperialist states based on the world market on the one hand and on state capital on the other. And like every resolution of imperialist conflict in the past, it lays the terrain for the emergence of the next round of imperialist conflict, as the First World War laid the terrain for the conflict that then developed in the Second World War, which laid the terrain for the Cold War. And the resolution of the Cold War has also fed into the terrain of the current new imperialist era. We can't just sit back and say, oh, well, let this happen, because there's the other side. The opposition to the drive to imperialist war and the opposition to our own ruling classes. I haven't addressed all the questions. I just want to finish, apologies for that. I want to finish with this. Look, Russia has a huge disparity of wealth. It is estimated that 500 people, 0.001%, control more wealth than the 99%, and own 40% of the entire household wealth of Russia. The wealth of Russia's billionaires surged 45% during the pandemic. It has the highest number of billionaires in the world per GDP. And on the other hand, you have the poverty-stricken industrial cities of the provinces, rural agriculture, and of course the ethnic minorities in the non-Russian republics. This is a viciously class society. It is a vicious imperialist power, and it takes place in the context of a world driven to competition. So the stakes are high. But we have to set our eyes both on the future prize, but on the possibilities for struggle today. And war is always a test for revolutionaries and for the left. And building a revolutionary pole is essential for the struggle now. You see, our tradition of state capitalism, I believe, has remained absolutely vital. I think it was sometimes felt after 91 that somehow this book had become sort of put on the shelf. I think that's wrong for this reason, that the principles underlying the question, the theory of state capital, were twofold. One, that we live in a world divided by competing imperialist states. Two, the act of the working class is the emancipation of the working class. The emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class itself. And those two pillars are related, because it's in emancipating itself that workers forge unity across nations, across borders, across divisions, against the imperialist powers in every country. And what I'd say to you, anyone here who's not a member of the SWP. The SWP is not going to bring the revolution, in the sense that the act of revolution is the act of the mass of the working class itself, internationally and at home. But all that we've discussed today points to the fact, to the need of political organisation, a revolutionary pole, a revolutionary organisation that can cut against the arguments that say, no, we have to, the only recourse is to support NATO in order to defend Ukraine. We have to look to that independent class force that was raised under the banner of the Russian Revolution during the First World War and in 1917-18, in the German Revolution at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the First World War. And for that reason, I would encourage anyone who's not a member to join us, because we've got a world to win and a fight to take on like no other.